Okay, so in this video we're going to be looking through the photos of the Chris Craft that's been in the shop for restoration. This video goes from the initial stages of the boat arriving through to me putting the first 2 layers of the new bottom on the boat. So Just Chillin' is a 1936 17-foot deluxe runabout, and here you can see when she first arrived at the shop she's in a pretty tired state. And quite a tight squeeze to get into the doors of the workshop, as you can see, but just about got her in there anyway. If anybody knows what that fitting is for, that's one thing that I'm trying to get to the bottom of. There's one of those in either side of the boat and you can see the inside of it there. Let me know in the comments below, it'd be quite interesting to try and find out what that might have been used for, and whether it's original. I don't think it probably is. As you can see, there's quite a bit of oil inside the boat there, collected in that oil pan and spilled pretty much all throughout the bilges, so quite a horrible operation to have to clean all that up. So the first thing to do is to get all the interior stripped out, so the seats and the cockpit side ceiling boards, floorboards, everything internally basically, so I could see the hull and what was going on with it. Not in a great condition by first inspection, as you can see. So then the boat was turned over and I started taking the bottom off. So initially I was exposing the heads of the screws with a view to kind of backing those out, but they're in such bad condition that the heads were just disintegrating, because they're all the original brass screws on this boat, so all of the heads were breaking. In the end I found the best method to get the planks off cleanly in one piece was just to run a pry bar up either side of a frame and just pop the heads off the screws and leave the shanks of the screws in place in the frames. So I ran down each frame line and just popped the planks off and got most of them off in one piece, which was quite nice. You see the condition of the chines there were pretty bad, big sort of lumps of filler in various sections, just packing out rotten pieces of wood. There are a few remnants of the original canvas left in between the internal and external planking layers, but not a great deal. So then I started taking off the internal planking layer. At this stage I was able to start to see the real extent of the condition of the framework, and it's pretty poor, to be honest. A lot of the frames are soaked with oil, a lot of rot that's set through this boat in various areas, and not a great deal of savable timber, which I found out later on when it came to actually taking each frame out one at a time and assessing it in its own proper entity. New wood delivery, so It's quite a nice day when you get some new timber turn up. So this boat's going to be planked in Sapele when I do the new planking. And that's a load of the boards there for the new framework and for the new planking on the boat. Shot of the chine there, so you can see the extent of the rot on the chines, and a lot of that had just been filled over the top of, just with car body filler. The aft end of the chines didn't actually make contact with the transom at all. They were just completely detached from the transom. And then off with the outer planking on the transom to reveal a real mess to the framework. So you can see at some stage the bottom bow of the transom has been cut in a lot shorter, and it had these strange sort of knees almost that had been put in where the chines meet the transom, or don't meet the transom in this case. And it looked to me like they'd been put in from the inside, because they had this sort of curved outer edge to them. It looked almost like they'd been pushed into place. So because of the really bad condition of the transom framing, my decision was to put the outer plank back on the bottom and use that as a former to make the new transom bow, because it was pretty much the only thing I had that I could get the transom curvature from. So the lower plank went back on, and then I used this melamine template on the top to just double that up and give me a nice square edge that I could form a lower transom bow to. So that was made up of 6 laminations of 6mm Sapele, glued up with epoxy, and then that formed my new lower transom bow, which would go from chine to chine right the way across the boat. And you can see how short the original transom bow was there. That's one of the knees, and those 2 tiny little screws are the only thing that were holding that in place. It was just fixed to that, and the outer planking wasn't fixed to the side cheeks of the transom or the chines in any way at all. So then I also made up a wider lamination which will form the top bow of the transom framing, which you'll see in a minute. And then it was a case of starting to get that in place and trying to get the sizes right. You see the top bow going in there and roughly cut to size. I started off just with everything oversized to give me plenty to fare back to. So then I started locating the vertical posts between the top and bottom bows, and those are located in place with these festal dominoes, which are a little bit like a sort of long biscuit basically, solid Sapele versions of those, and they just help to locate that joint and increase the glue surface area between the 2 parts. So that was the case for all of the middle sections, so the cheeks of the transom and the vertical posts as well. And again, everything's oversized on the transom at the moment, so there's plenty of extra material from what I was able to pattern from the original transom, because one of the real issues I had with this transom was knowing exactly what size it should be, because the chines didn't actually meet the original transom. The only thing I really had to go from to get the actual width was the planking that was on there, and even that was really badly cut about. So trying to get a definitive width for that was really quite difficult. And I actually didn't really get that dialed in properly until it came to laying the new chines in place, where I just had to sight the lines in and get the transom the right width. So then just putting a little bevel on the cheeks there just to match the originals, and it's on to gluing up the transom framing. So everything gets dry fitted probably 2 or 3 times really, just to make sure that it's all correct before I start gluing up. And then I just wet out all the end grain with unthickened epoxy, and then the joints go together with thickened epoxy. The little festal dominoes that you see there between the joints create a really tight fitting joint, so the top and bottom bows actually have to be pressed together with sash clamps, so they're really tight fitting. And then I'm using my little corner braces there just to make sure it's square. A couple of shots of the old transom versus the new one. It looks a little bit like some sort of archaeology scene, to be honest. That is a nail set into car body filler, and a big slug of filler that was in the top bow of the transom, just filling out the rotten sections there basically. So then I was able to clean up the boat enough to get the new transom in place, and that's just dry position for now whilst I then move on to the framework. So I got the keel and the chines out of the boat, and then it was a case of starting to work through all the intermediate frames. So they just came out one at a time and got stripped down and cleaned up on the bench just to assess their condition and whether some of them might have been reusable, but they were all pretty bad, to be honest. Either split down the screw lines or soaked with oil, or they'd just been cut about so badly over the time that they were just not feasible to go back in really. So I actually ended up replacing all of the bottom framing on this boat. So started with the intermediate frames and I just worked through replacing all of those. There's the epoxy delivery and the bronze delivery. Have a little guess at what you think the value of all those bronze fasteners was. Just pop that in the comments below and let me know what you think it came to. So working through the frames one at a time. Again, these are all cut oversized just to give me plenty to fair and bevel back to when I get the bottom shape dialed back in again. So you can see the lines there on the frames, which are the original patterned parts, and then I'm cutting slightly oversized just to give me some extra material there. And I worked through the stringers, just cleaning up each of the landings and trying to remove the screws where possible. Most of those had to be core drilled out in order to get them out of that timber. So then the intermediate frames go back in with some big silicone bronze screws. Originally these were steel screws holding these in place. So they're going back with big silicone bronze ones instead. And that frame there that's doubled up with the quarter sawn oak either side of it is the one that carries the prop shaft strut. So there's quite a bit of reinforcement in that area to take that. Then I started doing the keel landings on the intermediate frames. So I basically used the remaining complete frames and the original keel to get my keel landings right on the intermediate ones, and then the plan was after that to go back to the complete frames and use the new intermediate frames to then get my keel landings correct on that. So I made a start on the main frames, replacing those one at a time. And everything's just dry fit at this stage, so I'm just screwing all the parts together, getting them in place, getting the shape back in this boat, getting a proper keel line and a proper chine line, and then we'll get on to actually finally installing the pieces. So you can see that frame there, it was cut about to take that oil pan, so I've kind of retained some of that shape so that I can get the oil pan back in under the engine, but a bit more strength and material in the frame at the same time. Old versus new with the screws. So there you can see the keel landings cut in the intermediate frames, and they've not yet been cut in the main frames, so I'll go through those next. Again, everything's just dry fit at this stage, so it's just screwed in place to get its rough position. Then it was on to machining some chines. So the chines that I'm replacing on this boat are two-piece lamination. So the reason I went for that was because at that thickness of wood, it kind of auto fares itself. It follows the curve really nicely and just helped me to get that chine line back. Because I had very little information to go from on this boat, I wasn't able to get a table of offsets from the Mariners Museum. They didn't have any information on this boat, so I just had to work with what I got, and that thickness of chine helped me to get that line back into shape basically. Plus a laminated chine is going to be much stronger than original, so that's what I went for. And then once I got the chine line in and I was happy with everything, I decided that because the boat was braced quite well and nothing was moving around, I was going to do a complete strip down. So I then took everything back off, and that allowed me to completely pull the stringers out of the boat and get them properly cleaned up, which was quite nice because trying to clean them up in the boat just wasn't really working that well. So I was able to get them on the bench and get them properly cleaned. And I found the original hull number stamped in the top of them, so that was nice, and that stayed in place as well. That was a misaligned notch in one of the stringers, so that actually meant that I think it was frame 2 that was twisted within the boat by quite a large amount actually. And there were some strange things going on with the front end of this boat. It seemed that the stem and the forward frames and the keel sort of pointed off to one side, and the best I could work out is that it had always been like that from new. So I think that notch in the stringers was something to do with that, and I think the boat was probably just sort of fared to accommodate it in the end without correcting it. So I put all that back to straight. So then all of the frames were sealed with epoxy before being reinstalled. The stringers were sealed with epoxy as well, cleaned up with acetone and then sealed. Then all the frames were just keyed in the glue areas where they meet the stringers before being glued back into place with some thickened epoxy. And then the entire bottom was put back together with a laser line that I shot down from the centre line of the transom to the centre of the stem, and measured the stringers off that laser line and all the frames in a nice straight line right down the middle. So we got the boat back nice and straight, which was good, because I'm pretty sure it never really was that straight in the first place. Then it was a case of putting the chines in. So as I say, those are a two-piece laminated chine, which are 2 layers of 18mm Sapele. And you'll see that the construction of this boat is being changed slightly from original. So Originally you'd have a rabbited keel and chine on this boat. That's not going to be the case with this one, because I'm putting a cold moulded bottom on this. I'm running the planking right over the chines and butting it in the middle, so it's not quite the traditional construction that you would normally see on one of these boats. But my viewpoint on that is that I'm essentially building a new boat here. This is going to be 95% new boat, and in that instance it makes sense in my mind to change the construction for something that is modernised. It's going to be far less maintenance, much stronger, stiffer boat than the original. But from the outside it will look exactly as per the original. You'll be hard pressed to actually see the difference. So the keel was 2 layers of laminated Sapele again, so I laid them in place and then just shot a centre line down the middle again with a laser and beveled off the keel to take the plank in, same with the chines. And then I started laying a few planks in place just to make sure that everything was faired and we had the shape right. Broke out Grandad's old plane to get the keel straight, and then after a lot of fairing we're ready to start the planking. So this bottom is going to be 3 layers of cold moulded Sapele planking. So the first layer is laid diagonally as per the original internal layer on this boat, 45 degrees to the keel for most of the way, and that's all put in place with epoxy. All of the planks are edge glued and then glued down to all the framework. So internally this boat will look exactly the same as original. You'll still be able to see that diagonal planking line, and that's 6mm Sapele planking there. So I'm using 3 layers of 6mm Sapele planking. The bottom's going to be slightly thicker than original, so it's going to be pretty much a 3/4 inch bottom on this boat, which will be 3 layers of diagonal, all set in place with epoxy, complete cold moulded bottom. You can see the forward planking there, and that just slightly fans out in the angle that it meets the stem and the keel, just in order to get those planks to lay properly. So you can see that the forward plank is almost vertical, and then it fans out to the 45, probably by about sort of frame 3, something like that I would think. So then we're on to fairing the internal layer. So that was a lot of elbow grease and hard work. I pretty much did it all with hand planes because I just found that to be the best sort of feedback for me to be able to hear and feel what's going on with the planking and get it nice and fair where it needed to be. The majority of the fairing is really on this internal layer to get that shape just right, and it started to come together nicely, as you can see. So then once the internal layer was sort of roughly faired, I just went over that with some West epoxy and the low density filler fairing compound, just to get some of the low spots out there, so I didn't have to take too much material off the planking. So that was just coated and then roughly faired with a sanding block just to get things a little bit nicer and fill all the screw holes and some of the wood grain, stuff like that. Then the boat was completely sealed with neat epoxy and then peel plied, which is that fabric that you can see on there. So that just allows me to get a complete epoxy seal on that first layer, and the peel ply gives me that nice texture to then go straight on to gluing the second layer. So you can see that texture there that it leaves you. It's a nice keyed surface. That also means that when you pull the peel ply off, you take all the blush away from the epoxy as well, so there's no need to sand or wash that internal layer. Then it's on to layer 2 with the planking. So this is laid at 45 degrees again, but the opposite direction to the original layer, and this was vacuum bagged down. So each of the planks are just loosely stapled in place with Raptor plastic staples just to hold them roughly in place, and then the vacuum bag does the rest of the pull down, which is an unbelievable force, to be honest. This is the first time I've actually vacuum bagged the bottom of a boat, and the clamping hold down force of it is just unparalleled. There's nothing else I've ever seen that gets you that same kind of pull down, so it's a really great system. Purges all the air out of the joints in between the planks and just ensures you get no voids in there at all, so it's a really good way to do a bottom. And then we're on to the forward planking layer. So again, that's just laid in the same 45-degree angle with the planks thinning down slightly towards the stem just to make that curve nicely. And then again, that was vacuum bagged down, so we did this in 2 stages just to make it manageable to get it all glued up and bagged in time before the epoxy started to set. Then it was on to fairing the second layer, which was done a lot quicker than the first because we had a really good shape then to work to. So that's pretty much where I'm up to at the moment. So that's 2 layers done on the bottom. The next thing to do with the boat is going to be to turn the boat up the right way, and then I'm going to work on the sides. So I'm going to replace all the side framing, do the side planking. Then I'm going to turn the boat again, and I'm going to do the final bottom layer after the sides because I wanted that joint on the chine to be supported by the outer planking layer, which will come over the side planking, so that chine joint isn't in a sort of shear force basically, but it's actually supported from underneath. So that's near enough where I'm up to at the moment. The boat's now up the right way, and I'm starting on the side planking, and then the final bottom layer will come afterwards. So I've actually videoed the entire process of doing the bottom planking, so that's going to be coming out in a 3-part video series. So make sure you subscribe to the channel if you don't already follow it, and keep your eyes out for that, and it will come along as soon as I've got all the video edited. And I'll also do some other photo slideshows of the later on stages in the boat and right through to completion. So hope you found that interesting, and thanks for watching. Cheers guys.